The hammer struck the crumbling plaster with a dull thud that echoed through the abandoned sanctuary. Dust particles danced in the pale autumn sunlight streaming through broken stained-glass windows of St. Augustine's Church in Millbrook, Massachusetts. Thomas Whitmore, a contractor hired to demolish the building, wiped the sweat from his brow despite the October chill. "Mr. Whitmore, you should see this," called out his young apprentice, Daniel McAllister, his voice trembling with an emotion Thomas couldn't quite place. Thomas set down his sledgehammer and walked across the debris-strewn floor, his boots crunching on fragments of plaster and wood. Daniel stood before the eastern wall, where they had been methodically removing the deteriorating panels. In the cavity behind the wall, barely visible in the dim light, was a large oil painting in an ornate, gilded frame. "Careful now," Thomas instructed as they extracted the portrait from its hiding place. The frame was heavy, nearly 4 feet tall. As they carried it toward the light, Thomas felt an inexplicable coldness settle into his bones. They propped the painting against an intact section of wall and stepped back to examine it. The portrait depicted a family of 5. A stern-faced man in his 40s wearing a dark suit, a woman in her 30s with hollow eyes, and 3 children ranging from perhaps 6 to 12. The children's eyes seemed to follow him as he moved. Their faces, pale as porcelain, held expressions between fear and resignation. The mother's hands gripped something, knuckles white with tension. Most disturbing was a barely perceptible detail, scratches on the wall behind the family, as if someone had been clawing at the surface. "There's something written on the frame," Daniel said, pointing to a small brass plate affixed to the bottom. Thomas bent down, squinting to read the tarnished engraving. "The Holloway family, may God have mercy, 1853. "Holloway," Thomas murmured, the name triggering a distant memory. His grandfather had mentioned the Holloways once, many years ago, in hushed tones that suggested a story better left untold. Thomas had been too young to understand, but he remembered the look on the old man's face, a mixture of sorrow and horror. "Should we inform the church authorities?" Daniel asked. "The church has been abandoned for 15 years, Thomas replied, unable to tear his eyes from the painting. "Whoever hid this wanted it to remain hidden. But why?" As if in response to his question, a yellowed paper slipped from behind the frame. Thomas picked it up carefully, his hands trembling. The paper was brittle with age, covered in cramped handwriting. He began to read aloud. "To whomever finds this testament, know that what transpired within these walls was an abomination against God and man. The Holloway family came to our congregation in winter 1852, seeking refuge and redemption. Josiah Holloway claimed to be a merchant from Virginia, but there were whispers of darker truths. His wife, Margaret, rarely spoke. The children, Sarah, William, and little Thomas, bore marks of souls who had witnessed horrors. I am Reverend Jonathan Blackwood, and I write this as my final confession, for I was complicit in evil." Thomas looked up from the letter, meeting Daniel's wide eyes. "There's more," he said, turning the paper over. "The Holloways attended services every Sunday, sitting in the last pew, never mixing with others. Josiah would watch families with an intensity that made people uncomfortable. He spoke of freedom as if it were foreign. Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard noticed bruises on young Sarah's arms. When questioned, Margaret Holloway became hysterical, insisting they were leaving immediately." The afternoon light was fading. Thomas continued reading, his voice barely above a whisper. "But they never left Millbrook. On November 3rd, 1852, I was summoned to the Holloway residence by a frantic neighbor who reported screaming. When I arrived with Sheriff Davies, we found the house dark and silent. The front door was unlocked. Inside, dinner plates still sat on the table, a fire dying in the hearth. But the Holloway family was gone. All 5 of them vanished." Daniel's face had gone pale. "They just disappeared?" Thomas held up a hand and continued reading. The investigation revealed disturbing details. In the cellar, Sheriff Davies discovered chains bolted to the wall. In the master bedroom, we found a locked trunk containing documents exposing Josiah Holloway's true identity. He was not a merchant, but a slave trader from Richmond, Virginia, one of the most brutal in his trade. The documents detailed transactions, families he had torn apart for profit. Thomas paused, his throat tight. The portrait seemed to watch him. He forced himself to continue. But there was something more that explained Margaret's haunted eyes. Margaret Holloway had been born into slavery. Josiah had taken her as his mistress, later claiming her as his wife when she bore him 3 children. By all legal definitions, Margaret and her children were his property, not his family. They lived in a gilded cage, appearing respectable while living in terror. The implications sent ice through his veins. This wasn't just disappearance. It was a tale of human bondage, of souls trapped in nightmare. The authorities searched for weeks, Thomas continued. They dragged the river, combed the woods. Some believed the family had fled to Canada. Others whispered darker theories that perhaps Margaret had ended their suffering by her own hand. Daniel crossed himself. And the portrait? Thomas read on. Josiah Holloway had commissioned this portrait weeks before their disappearance. When delivered to the church, the family was already gone. I could not bear to display it, knowing what I knew, so I hid it behind the wall during renovations. Let whoever finds it know, we, the people of Millbrook, failed the Holloway family. We saw signs and chose silence. We valued comfort over their freedom. The letter concluded, I have searched my soul and found it wanting. How many Sundays did I preach about liberty while a woman and her children lived as chattel? If they found freedom in death, then they are more free than we who remain, shackled by cowardice. May this portrait serve as testimony to our collective sin. Signed, Reverend Jonathan Blackwood, December 1852. Silence filled the church. Thomas carefully folded the letter and looked again at the portrait. Now he saw the painting with new eyes. The children's fear was captured reality. Margaret's gripped hands were holding on to her children, perhaps for the last time, and Josiah's stern expression took on a sinister quality. What do we do with this? Daniel asked, his voice small in the vast emptiness of the abandoned church. Thomas thought for a long moment, watching as the last rays of sunlight illuminated the portrait, seeming to bring the painted faces momentarily to life. We do what Reverend Blackwood asked, he finally said. We bear witness, we tell their story, we ensure their suffering is not forgotten. But we don't know what happened to them, Daniel protested. We don't know if they escaped or if something worse befell them. Perhaps that's the point, Thomas replied quietly. Perhaps not knowing is part of the testimony. How many families like the Holloways simply vanished from history, their fates unknown, their stories untold? This portrait is more than a painting. It's evidence of a crime that our entire society perpetrated, one that we're still reckoning with. As darkness fell over the abandoned church, Thomas made a decision. He would not leave the portrait to be destroyed with the building. He would take it to the Millbrook Historical Society, along with Reverend Blackwood's confession. The truth needed to see daylight, however uncomfortable it might be. But as he and Daniel carefully wrapped the portrait in canvas and prepared to transport it, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the Holloway's story wasn't quite finished. There was something more here, something the letter hadn't revealed. The manner of their disappearance, the completeness of their vanishing, suggested a level of planning and determination that went beyond a simple flight in the night. Mr. Whitmore, Daniel said as they loaded the portrait onto their wagon, do you think they made it? To Canada, I mean? Do you think they found their freedom? Thomas looked back at the darkened church, its broken steeple pointing like an accusing finger at the heavens. I don't know, Daniel, but I hope so. God, I hope so. As they drove away, Neither man noticed the figure standing in the shadow of the church's eastern wall, watching them leave. An elderly woman, her face weathered by time and hardship, her eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and remembered terror. She had been waiting 61 years for someone to find that portrait, for someone to tell the story that had been buried with the church's secrets. Now, finally, the truth could begin to emerge, piece by terrible piece. The woman turned and walked into the gathering darkness, disappearing as completely as the Holloways had on that November night so long ago. But this time, the disappearance was one of choice, of a witness who had finally seen justice begin. However late, however incomplete, the Millbrook Historical Society occupied a modest brick building on Main Street, its windows overlooking the town square, where a monument to Union soldiers stood as a reminder of the war that had finally ended the institution of slavery. Thomas Whitmore and Daniel McAllister carried the portrait through the front door on a grey November morning. Exactly 1 week after its discovery, Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the Society's curator and a woman known for her meticulous research and sharp intellect, looked up from her desk as they entered. She was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. When she saw the portrait, those eyes widened with recognition. "Dear God," she whispered, rising from her chair. "The Holloway portrait, after all these years." Thomas was startled. "You know about this painting?" Mrs. Thornton approached the portrait slowly, as if it might bite. "Know about it? I've spent 30 years researching the Holloway disappearance. It's one of the great unsolved mysteries of Massachusetts history, but I had no idea a portrait existed." Her fingers trembled as she reached out to touch the frame, then drew back. "Where did you find it?" Thomas explained the discovery behind the church wall and handed her Reverend Blackwood's letter. Mrs. Thornton read it in silence, her face growing increasingly pale. When she finished, she sank into the nearest chair, the letter clutched in her hands. "My God," she repeated. "I knew parts of this story, but not all of it. Not the truth about Margaret and the children." She looked up at Thomas, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Do you understand what you found? This isn't just a portrait. It's evidence of one of the darkest chapters in our town's history." "What can you tell us about the Holloways?" Thomas asked, pulling up a chair. Daniel stood by the portrait, unable to look away from the painted faces. Mrs. Thornton gathered her composure and began to speak, her voice taking on the cadence of a natural storyteller. "The Holloways arrived in Millbrook in January of 1852, during one of the coldest winters on record. Josiah Holloway claimed to be a merchant seeking new opportunities in the north. He purchased a large house on Elm Street, paid in cash, and immediately set about establishing himself as a pillar of the community." She stood and walked to a filing cabinet, extracting a worn leather folder. "I have collected newspaper clippings, census records, everything I could find about that period." The Millbrook Gazette reported on the Holloways' arrival, describing them as a respectable Southern family seeking the prosperity of Northern commerce. But there were inconsistencies from the beginning. Mrs. Thornton spread several documents on her desk. According to the census taken in June 1852, the Holloway household consisted of 5 family members and 2 servants, both listed as Irish immigrants. But neighbors reported seeing Margaret Holloway performing servant duties herself, scrubbing floors, hanging laundry. One account from a local seamstress mentions that when Margaret came to have a dress mended, she had no money of her own, had to ask Josiah's permission for every expenditure. Thomas leaned forward, studying the documents. The letter mentioned that Margaret was born into slavery. How did no one in town realize this? "Because they didn't want to see it," Mrs. Thornton replied, her voice hard with anger. By 1852, tensions between North and South were reaching a breaking point. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had made it legal for slave catchers to operate even in free states. to drag escaped slaves back to bondage. Many Northerners, even those who claimed to oppose slavery, were more interested in avoiding conflict than in confronting injustice. She pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping, its edges crumbling with age. "Look at this. From November 1852, right after the disappearance, the mysterious vanishing of the Holloway family has sparked much speculation. Sheriff Davies reports that despite extensive investigation, no trace of the family has been found. Some theorize they have relocated to the Western Territories, others suggest foul play. The case remains open, though hope of resolution dims with each passing day." "Nothing about Margaret's true identity," Daniel observed. "Nothing about the chains in the cellar or the documents revealing Josiah's occupation." "Exactly," Mrs. Thornton confirmed. "The truth was too uncomfortable, too close to home. The people of Millbrook wanted to believe they were better than their southern counterparts, that slavery was a distant evil that didn't touch their lives. The Holloway case forced them to confront the reality that evil doesn't respect geographic boundaries, that complicity takes many forms." Thomas studied the portrait again, his trained eye now picking up details he had missed before. "Mrs. Thornton, look at this." He pointed to the background of the painting, to the scratches on the wall. "These marks, they're deliberate. The artist included them for a reason." Mrs. Thornton retrieved a magnifying glass from her desk and examined the painting closely. "You're right. These aren't artistic flourishes. They look like tally marks, like someone counting days." She moved the glass across the painting's surface. "And here, look at Margaret's dress. The hem is torn, deliberately painted that way. And the children's feet. They're bare despite the formal setting of the portrait." "The artist was trying to tell the truth," Daniel said softly, "even when the subjects couldn't speak it themselves." Mrs. Thornton nodded. "The portrait was painted by a local artist named Samuel Whitfield. I have records showing that Josiah Holloway commissioned it in October 1852, paying a substantial sum. Whitfield was known for his realistic style, for capturing not just the physical appearance of his subjects, but something of their essence." She paused, consulting her notes. Whitfield died in 1855, but before his death, he gave an interview to the Gazette about his artistic philosophy. He said, "A portrait should be more than flattery. It should be truth, even when truth is uncomfortable." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He knew. He saw what was happening to that family and tried to document it in the only way he could. "But it wasn't enough," Mrs. Thornton said bitterly. "Whatever Whitfield captured on canvas, whatever evidence he tried to preserve, it all ended up hidden behind a church wall, buried with the truth." She turned to Thomas, her expression intense. "Now that you've found it, what do you intend to do with it?" Before Thomas could answer, the door to the Historical Society burst open. A tall man in his 70s strode in, his face flushed with agitation. He was impeccably dressed, with a silver watch chain across his vest, and an air of authority that filled the room. "Mrs. Thornton," he said curtly, barely acknowledging Thomas and Daniel. "I heard rumors about a portrait being discovered at the old church. I'm here to claim it." Mrs. Thornton's expression hardened. "Mayor Holloway, I wasn't expecting you." Thomas felt his stomach drop. Holloway. This man was a descendant of the family in the portrait. Mayor Edmund Holloway walked directly to the painting, his eyes scanning it with an unreadable expression. "This belongs to my family," he stated. "My great-grandfather's portrait has no business being displayed in a public institution." "Your great-grandfather?" Mrs. Thornton's voice dripped with contempt. "Which great-grandfather, Mayor? The slave trader Josiah Holloway, or perhaps one of his victims?" The mayor's face reddened. "I will not stand here and have my family name slandered by baseless accusations and ancient gossip." "Gossip?" Thomas interjected, his anger rising. "We found a signed confession from Reverend Blackwood detailing your ancestors' crimes." Mayor Holloway turned to him with cold eyes. Reverend Blackwood was a known hysteric who died in an asylum. His confession is worth nothing. He pointed at the portrait. This painting is private property, and I'm taking it. Over my dead body, Mrs. Thornton said flatly. This portrait is a historical artifact that belongs to the people of Millbrook. It tells a story that needs to be told, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes the descendants of perpetrators. The standoff was interrupted by the arrival of another visitor, a distinguished African-American gentleman in his 50s, wearing a professor's tweed jacket. He carried a leather satchel and exuded an air of quiet confidence. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said, "but I couldn't help overhearing the commotion. My name is Professor Marcus Freeman from the Massachusetts Historical Commission. I've been researching antebellum slavery in northern states, and I believe I may have information relevant to your discussion." Mayor Holloway's eyes narrowed. "This is a private matter, Professor. Your expertise is not required." Professor Freeman ignored him, turning instead to Mrs. Thornton. "May I see the portrait?" Mrs. Thornton gestured toward it, and Professor Freeman approached, his expression growing more somber with each step. He studied the painting for several long minutes, then opened his satchel and withdrew a folder of documents. "I've been researching a network of slave traders who operated in Virginia in the years leading up to the Civil War," he explained. "Josiah Holloway was one of the most brutal. His records, which I obtained from Confederate archives, show that he specialized in breaking families apart, selling children away from their mothers, husbands from wives. He kept meticulous records of his transactions." He spread several photocopied documents on Mrs. Thornton's desk. In 1847, Josiah Holloway purchased a young woman named Margaret from a plantation in Richmond. She was 18 years old, educated, had been raised as a house slave. The records show that Holloway took her as his mistress, fathering 3 children with her over the next 5 years. Mayor Holloway's face had gone pale, but he said nothing. Professor Freeman continued, his voice steady but filled with suppressed emotion. In 1851, Josiah Holloway's business came under scrutiny from Virginia authorities. There were accusations of fraud, of selling slaves who were actually free citizens, of forging documents. Facing possible prosecution, he fled north with Margaret and the children, setting up this elaborate charade of being a respectable family. "Why would he bring them with him?" Daniel asked. "If he was fleeing, why not just abandon them?" "Because they were his property," Professor Freeman replied grimly. "In his mind, they represented significant financial value, and perhaps in his twisted way, he believed he loved them. The psychology of slaveholders is complex, built on layers of self-delusion and rationalization." Mrs. Thornton had been listening intently. "Professor Freeman, you said you have records. Do they indicate what happened to the family after they disappeared?" Professor Freeman hesitated, then pulled out one final document. This is where the story takes an even darker turn. In December 1852, a month after the Holloway disappearance, a conductor on the Underground Railroad in Vermont reported helping a woman and 3 children escape to Canada. The description matches Margaret and her children perfectly, but there's a detail that's haunting. He read from the document. The woman was in a state of severe distress, barely able to speak. She carried with her a bloodied knife and kept repeating, "He'll never own us again. He'll never own anyone again." When questioned about the whereabouts of the man accompanying them, she would only say, "He's sleeping in the house on Elm Street, and he'll sleep forever." The room fell silent. Thomas felt his blood run cold as the implications sank in. "She killed him," he whispered. "Margaret killed Josiah." "An unverified claim from an anonymous source," Mayor Holloway protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Professor Freeman met his eyes. In 1853, workers renovating the house on Elm Street reported finding a sealed room in the cellar that hadn't appeared in the original floor plans. When they opened it, they found skeletal remains that were presumed to be those of a vagrant who had broken in and died. The remains were buried in a pauper's grave without much investigation. He paused. I believe those remains were actually Josiah Holloway's. Mrs. Thornton was nodding slowly. It makes sense. Margaret knew that if they simply disappeared, Josiah would be listed as a missing person, and slave catchers would continue to search for her and the children. But if Josiah was dead and buried, even in an unmarked grave, the threat would end. This is nothing but speculation, Mayor Holloway shouted, his composure finally breaking. You're trying to turn a respectable family into villains and make a murderer into a hero. She wasn't a murderer, Thomas said quietly, surprised by his own certainty. She was a mother protecting her children. She was a human being, asserting her right to freedom and life. Professor Freeman placed his hand on the portrait's frame, his touch gentle, almost reverent. This painting is more than a family portrait. It's a document of resistance, a testament to the strength of the human spirit when faced with absolute degradation. Look at Margaret's eyes in this painting. She's not broken. She's calculating, planning, waiting for her moment. Thomas looked again at the portrait with this new understanding. Professor Freeman was right. Margaret's hollow eyes weren't defeated. They were determined. The way she gripped her children wasn't desperation, but protection. She was already planning their escape, perhaps already knew that blood would need to be spilled for freedom to be won. The question now, Mrs. Thornton said, her voice businesslike despite the emotional weight of the moment, is what we do with this information. We have a portrait, a confession from a reverend, historical records, and a compelling theory about what really happened to the Holloway family. Mayor Holloway had been standing in angry silence, but now he spoke, his voice weary. Do you know what this will do to my family's reputation, my children, my grandchildren? They'll bear the stain of Josiah Holloway's sins. Your family has been bearing that stain for generations, Professor Freeman replied, not unkindly. The only difference is that now it will be visible. But here's the thing about historical truth, Mayor Holloway. It doesn't cease to exist because we choose to ignore it. Your ancestors' crimes are facts, regardless of whether they're acknowledged. And Margaret's courage is also a fact, Mrs. Thornton added. This portrait can tell both stories, the horror of what was done to her family and the extraordinary strength it took for her to free them. Thomas had been quiet, thinking. Now he spoke up. There's something else we need to consider. Professor Freeman, you said Margaret and the children made it to Vermont. Is there any record of them after that? Did they actually make it to Canada? Did they survive? Professor Freeman shook his head sadly. That's where the trail goes cold. The Underground Railroad conductors were deliberately vague in their record-keeping to protect the people they helped. There's no definitive evidence of what happened to Margaret and her children after they crossed into Vermont. They simply vanished into freedom, if freedom is what they found. Or they vanished into death, Mayor Holloway said bitterly. Women and children trying to cross the border in winter with no resources, no protection. The odds of their survival were minimal. But possible, Daniel interjected. Hope is possible. That's what this portrait represents, isn't it? The possibility of freedom, the possibility of dignity, even in the face of overwhelming evil. Mrs. Thornton looked at the young man with approval. Well said, Daniel. That's exactly what this portrait represents. She turned to the group. I propose that we establish an exhibition here at the Historical Society. We'll display the portrait along with all the evidence we've gathered, Reverend Blackwood's confession, Professor Freeman's research, everything. We'll tell the complete story, uncomfortable as it may be. "And what about my family's privacy?" Mayor Holloway demanded. "What about Margaret's privacy?" Professor Freeman countered. "What about the privacy of the hundreds of people your ancestor enslaved, bought and sold? History doesn't belong to the powerful anymore, Mayor. It belongs to everyone, especially to those whose voices were silenced." The debate continued, but Thomas's attention had been drawn back to the portrait. In the afternoon light, with all he now knew about the people depicted, the painting seemed transformed. He could see the story in every brushstroke: Josiah's arrogant presumption that he would always own his family, Margaret's quiet fury and determination, the children's resilience in the face of unimaginable circumstances, and there, in the background, those scratches on the wall that Samuel Whitfield had so carefully included. Thomas realized they weren't just tally marks counting days of captivity. They were a message from the artist himself, a coded testament that someday someone would understand what he had witnessed and tried to preserve. As the sun set and the group continued their discussion, Thomas made a silent promise to the faces in the portrait. Their story would be told. The truth would emerge, however painful, however complicated, because the alternative, silence and erasure, was a continuation of the original crime. 3 months passed, and the portrait hung in the main gallery of the Millbrook Historical Society, centerpiece of an exhibition titled Hidden Histories: The Holloway Family and the Legacy of Slavery in New England. The opening night drew a crowd larger than any event the Historical Society had ever hosted. People came from across Massachusetts and beyond, drawn by newspaper articles and word of mouth about the remarkable discovery. Thomas Whitmore stood in the corner of the gallery, watching visitors examine the portrait and read the accompanying panels that told the Holloway's story. Mrs. Thornton had done an exceptional job curating the exhibition, presenting the facts without sensationalism, but also without pulling punches about the reality of what Margaret and her children had endured. The controversy had been immediate and intense. Mayor Edmund Holloway had attempted to block the exhibition through legal channels, arguing that it defamed his family. But Professor Marcus Freeman had rallied support from historians and civil rights organizations across the country. The resulting media attention had turned the Holloway portrait into a symbol of something larger, the ongoing struggle to reckon with America's history of slavery and its continuing impact. "Mr. Whitmore," a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Thomas turned to find an elderly African-American woman standing beside him. She was diminutive, perhaps 5 feet tall, with white hair and eyes that held depths of experience. She wore a simple but elegant dress and carried herself with quiet dignity. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied, something in her presence commanding his respect. "I've been waiting to speak with you," she said. "My name is Clara Holloway Thompson. I believe you found my great-great-grandmother's portrait." Thomas felt his heart skip. Margaret's descendant. But we thought, the record showed that they disappeared, that there was no way to trace. "That's what everyone was meant to believe," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My great-great-grandmother Margaret was very careful to cover her tracks. She had to be. Even after Josiah was dead, even after they reached Canada, the fear never truly left her." Clara looked up at the portrait, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I've never seen this painting before. I knew it existed, but I never thought I'd see it." "How did you know about it?" Thomas asked, his mind racing with questions. "Family stories," Clara replied. "Passed down through generations, mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter. The oral history of people who couldn't risk writing things down, who couldn't trust official records." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This belonged to my great-great-grandmother. She wrote it in the last years of her life, in Toronto. She wanted us to know the truth, even if she couldn't share it with the world. Thomas looked around the crowded gallery. Would you be willing to share what's in that journal with Mrs. Thornton and Professor Freeman? Clara hesitated, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. I've kept these words private for so long, but seeing this portrait, seeing my ancestor's story finally being told, she nodded. Yes, it's time. An hour later, they were seated in Mrs. Thornton's office. The curator and Professor Freeman sat across from Clara, who had laid the journal on the desk between them. Daniel had joined them as well, unable to contain his curiosity about the story's continuation. Before I share this, Clara began, her voice steadier now, you need to understand the context. Margaret lived in Toronto for 43 years after escaping Millbrook. She remarried, had more children, lived a life of freedom. But she was never fully free from the past. The trauma of those years with Josiah Holloway marked her until the day she died. She opened the journal, and Thomas saw pages filled with elegant handwriting. The ink faded but still legible. Clara began to read, My name is Margaret Elizabeth Holloway Freeman, and I'm writing this in the year 1895, knowing that my time on this earth grows short. I have kept silent about my past for 40 years, protecting my children and grandchildren from the shame and danger that knowledge of our history might bring. But I cannot die with these truths unspoken. Someone must know what we endured, what we survived, and what price was paid for our freedom. Clara paused, composing herself before continuing. I was born Margaret Elizabeth Carter in 1829, daughter of a house slave and the plantation owner who raped her. My mother died when I was 5, and I was raised in the main house, taught to read and write by the master's wife, who pitied me. By the time I was 16, I understood that this education was not kindness, but preparation for a different kind of servitude. Professor Freeman leaned forward, his scholarly interest mixed with visible emotion. Clara continued reading. In 1847, I was sold to Josiah Holloway. He was 31 years old, already known as a harsh man in the business of buying and selling human beings. But he wanted me for himself, not for resale. He called me his wife in private, though no law recognized such a union between master and slave. When I bore him a daughter, Sarah, in 1848, I hoped perhaps motherhood would soften him, would make him see us as human beings deserving of dignity. Clara's voice broke slightly, but she pressed on. I was wrong. If anything, Sarah's birth made Josiah more possessive, more controlling. He saw her as proof of his power over me, another piece of property he owned. When William was born in 1849 and little Thomas in 1851, my chains grew heavier, not lighter. I was trapped not just by law and violence, but by love for my children. I could not escape without them, and Josiah knew it. Mrs. Thornton handed Clara a glass of water. The elderly woman took a sip, then continued. In 1851, Josiah's business affairs began to crumble. He had made powerful enemies in Virginia, had sold people who were actually free, had forged documents. When the authorities came asking questions, he panicked. In the middle of the night, he woke us and said we were leaving, going north where we would start fresh. I thought perhaps this was my chance, that in the north I might find allies, people who would help us escape. But Millbrook was no refuge, Thomas murmured. Clara nodded and read on. Millbrook was a beautiful prison. Josiah bought a house, presented us as a respectable family, even commissioned a portrait to hang in the church. He thought if he could make the facade real enough, it would become true. But I saw the truth in the eyes of the townspeople. They knew, or suspected, or chose not to know. It amounted to the same thing. We were alone, and no one would help us. The journal entry shifted, Margaret's handwriting becoming more cramped and urgent. The artist who painted our portrait, Samuel Whitfield, was the first person in Millbrook to truly see me. During our sittings, when Josiah would leave the room to smoke his cigars, Mr. Whitfield would ask me questions. Not prying questions, but gentle inquiries about my well-being, about the children. He noticed the marks on my arms where Josiah's fingers had bruised my flesh. He saw the fear in my children's eyes. And though he never said it explicitly, I knew he understood. That explains why he included those details in the portrait, Professor Freeman said. The bare feet, the torn hem, the scratches on the wall. He was documenting evidence. Clara continued reading. Mr. Whitfield told me once very quietly that freedom was a right, not a privilege. He said that every human being was entitled to liberty, regardless of what the law said. He told me about the Underground Railroad, about conductors who helped people like us escape to Canada. He didn't offer to help directly, but he planted seeds of hope that began to grow. The journal's tone changed, becoming darker. On November 2nd, 1852, everything changed. Josiah received a letter from Virginia. I don't know what it contained, but whatever news it brought sent him into a rage. He beat me that night worse than ever before. He said we were leaving Millbrook, going west where no one knew us, where no one would question his authority over his family. He said if I tried to resist, if I tried to leave him, he would sell our children separately to the worst plantations in the Deep South, would make sure I never saw them again. Clara's hands were shaking as she read the next passage. That night, after Josiah fell into drunken sleep, I made my decision. I had 3 choices: stay and watch my children grow up as slaves, try to escape and risk Josiah hunting us down, or make certain that he could never hurt us again. I chose the 3rd option. The room was utterly silent. Clara's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I took a knife from the kitchen. I went down to the cellar where Josiah had built that terrible room. That place where he chained us when he wanted to remind us of our powerlessness. I led him there, told him I wanted to submit to him, to accept my place. He was drunk and arrogant enough to believe me. And when he turned his back, when he bent to unlock the chains, I ended his life. Mrs. Thornton's hand covered her mouth. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face, though he hadn't realized he was crying. Clara read on, Margaret's words unflinching. I will not describe what I did in detail, for those memories are burden enough without passing them to others. I will say only that I made certain he was dead, that he would never again own anyone, never again sell children away from their mothers, never again claim a human being as property. Then I sealed that room, took my children, and we ran. The next entries described their flight through Massachusetts in the dead of winter, a desperate journey guided by sympathetic conductors on the Underground Railroad. Margaret wrote of near captures, of hiding in root cellars and barns, of her children's bravery in the face of terror. We reached Vermont on November 15th, Clara read. A Quaker family hid us in their barn for 2 weeks, while arrangements were made for our crossing into Canada. The man who helped us, a conductor named Samuel Morrison, asked no questions about where we came from or what we had left behind. He only asked if we were ready for freedom, and when I said yes, he made it happen. Margaret's journal described crossing the border into Canada on a bitter December morning, the moment when they stood on Canadian soil and realized they were finally, truly free from the reach of American slave laws. I fell to my knees in the snow and wept, Clara read, her voice thick with emotion. Not tears of joy, though I felt joy. Not tears of relief, though I felt relief. But tears of grief for all the years stolen from us, for all the people still suffering in bondage, for the life we had been forced to leave behind. Freedom came at such a terrible cost, and even now, decades later, I wonder if that cost will ever truly be paid. The journal entries continued, describing Margaret's life in Toronto. She had changed her surname to Freeman, a symbolic rejection of the Holloway name. She found work as a seamstress, remarried eventually to a freedman named Robert Freeman, who treated her with kindness and respect. Her children grew up free, educated, able to make their own choices. But the trauma never fully healed. Clara read passages where Margaret described nightmares, moments when she would see a man who reminded her of Josiah and be paralyzed with fear, times when the sound of chains would send her into panic. "The body may escape slavery," Margaret had written, "but the mind remains partially imprisoned. Even now, 40 years later, I sometimes wake in the night certain that Josiah is standing over me, that this life of freedom is just a dream from which I will soon wake to find myself back in that house on Elm Street." The journal's final entry was dated June 1895, just weeks before Margaret's death. "I am 76 years old, and I can feel death approaching. I am not afraid. I have lived a life of freedom, raised my children in freedom, seen my grandchildren born into a world where they will never know the chains I wore. But I think often of that portrait, the one Josiah commissioned to display his respectability. I wonder if it still exists, if anyone will ever see it and understand what it truly depicts. Not a family, but a woman and her children held captive by a monster. If someone does find it, if someone does see beneath the surface of that painted facade, I hope they will understand what we sacrificed for freedom. I hope they will remember that liberty is not given, but taken, that dignity is not granted, but claimed. And I hope they will ensure that what we endured is never forgotten, never dismissed, never swept aside in the name of comfort or convenience. May God have mercy on all of us, the living and the dead." Clara closed the journal, tears streaming down her weathered face. The room remained silent for a long moment, each person processing the weight of Margaret's words. Finally, Mrs. Thornton spoke, her voice hoarse. "Clara, this journal is extraordinary. It's a first-hand account of slavery, escape, and survival. It needs to be part of the exhibition." Clara nodded. "I know. That's why I came forward. That's why I'm breaking decades of family silence. My great-great-grandmother's story deserves to be told, and not just as a footnote to her oppressor's crimes." Professor Freeman was shaking his head in wonder. "This changes everything we know about the Underground Railroad in this region. Margaret's account provides details we've never had before, names of conductors, routes, methods of escape. This is invaluable historical documentation." "It's more than documentation," Thomas said quietly. "It's testimony. It's truth." He looked at Clara with deep respect. "Thank you for trusting us with this. Thank you for your courage in sharing your family's story." Clara smiled sadly. "I'm an old woman, Mr. Whitmore. I've spent my whole life protecting these secrets, protecting my family from the shame and danger that comes with being descended from both enslaver and enslaved. But I realized something when I saw that portrait. The shame was never ours to carry. The shame belongs to Josiah Holloway and everyone who enabled him, everyone who looked away, everyone who valued their comfort over justice." "What about the rest of your family?" Mrs. Thornton asked. "Do they know you're here? Do they know you're sharing Margaret's journal?" "Some do, some don't. My children and grandchildren know. They support my decision. But there are other branches of the family who have married into white families, who have passed as white for generations. Revealing this history will impact them, potentially expose secrets they've kept for their entire lives." Clara's expression was resolute. "But I believe the truth is more important than convenience. I believe Margaret would want her story told, completely and honestly." The exhibition was expanded to include Margaret's journal, displayed alongside the portrait. Clara agreed to be interviewed, her oral history recorded for posterity. The local newspaper ran a series of articles about the Holloway case, sparking renewed interest in uncovering other hidden histories of slavery in northern states. But not everyone was pleased with these developments. Mayor Edmund Holloway, confronted with undeniable evidence of his ancestors' crimes and his enslaved ancestors' courage, found himself in an impossible position. He could continue to deny the truth and be branded a racist and a coward, or he could acknowledge the reality of his family's history and face the consequences. He chose a third option. The letter arrived at the Historical Society on a cold March morning. Mrs. Thornton opened it to find a handwritten note from Mayor Edmund Holloway, requesting a private meeting. Despite her reservations, she agreed, curiosity overcoming caution. Mayor Holloway arrived punctually, but Thomas barely recognized him. The proud, angry man who had burst into the Historical Society months earlier had been transformed. He looked older, thinner, as if the weight of his ancestors' crimes had physically diminished him. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm. "Mrs. Thornton, thank you for seeing me," he said quietly. "And, Mr. Whitmore, I'm glad you're here as well. What I have to say concerns you both." He placed the portfolio on the desk. "I've spent the past 3 months doing research of my own, digging into my family history. What I've found has forced me to confront uncomfortable truths." He opened the portfolio, revealing documents, photographs, and letters. "My family has been in Millbrook for 6 generations. We've been mayors, merchants, civic leaders. We've prided ourselves on our respectability, our standing in the community. But that standing was built on a foundation of blood and suffering." Mayor Holloway pulled out a daguerreotype photograph. It showed a woman and 3 children, their faces bearing a striking resemblance to the painted figures in the portrait. This photograph was taken in Toronto in 1867, 15 years after Margaret and the children escaped. I found it in my grandmother's attic, hidden in a box of documents we were told never to open. Thomas took the photograph, his heart pounding. The woman in the image was older than Margaret appeared in the portrait, but the resemblance was unmistakable, and beside her stood 3 young adults, Sarah, William, and Thomas Holloway Freeman, alive and healthy and free. "My God," Mrs. Thornton whispered. "They survived. They made it." Mayor Holloway nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Not only did they survive, they thrived." Margaret remarried, as we now know from Clara's testimony. Her children received educations, raised families of their own. Sarah became a teacher, William a carpenter, and young Thomas a physician. He spread out more documents. "I have birth certificates, marriage licenses, census records. Margaret's descendants are scattered across Canada and the United States. Some of them are my cousins, though neither branch of the family knew about the other until now." "Why are you showing us this?" Thomas asked. "Because I was wrong," Mayor Holloway said simply. "I was wrong to try to suppress this story, wrong to prioritize my family's reputation over historical truth, wrong to treat Margaret and her children as an embarrassment rather than as heroes." He pulled out another document, this one more recent. "I've established a scholarship fund in Margaret Freeman's name to support descendants of enslaved people pursuing education. It's the least I can do to begin making amends for Josiah Holloway's crimes." Mrs. Thornton studied the mayor's face, searching for sincerity. "This is quite a reversal, Mayor. What changed your mind?" "I met Clara," he replied. "Clara Thompson, Margaret's great-great-granddaughter. She reached out to me after the exhibition opened, said she wanted to talk. I agreed, expecting accusations and anger. Instead, she showed me compassion. She told me about Margaret's life in Toronto, about the family Margaret built, about the legacy of resilience and courage that Margaret passed down through generations." His voice broke. "She told me that Margaret never hated Josiah's descendants. She hoped we would be better than he was, that we would choose justice over cruelty." He looked up at the portrait hanging on the wall. "I've been looking at this painting every day since the exhibition opened. At first, all I could see was shame, but Clara taught me to see something else. Possibility. Josiah Holloway chose evil. chose to treat human beings as property, but his descendants don't have to make that same choice. We can acknowledge the truth, face our history honestly, and work to ensure nothing like that ever happens again. Thomas was moved by the mayor's words, but he remained cautious. Words are easy, Mayor. What are you actually prepared to do? Mayor Holloway straightened his shoulders. I'm resigning from my position as mayor. I'm donating my family's estate to be converted into a museum dedicated to telling the stories of enslaved people in New England, and I'm using my influence to push for educational reforms that honestly address the history of slavery in northern states, not just southern ones. He pulled out one final document, a legal paper with multiple signatures. This is a deed transferring ownership of the house on Elm Street to the Historical Society, the house where Margaret was held captive, where she killed her captor and claimed her freedom. I want it preserved as a historic site, a place where future generations can learn about the true cost of slavery and the courage required to resist it. Mrs. Thornton accepted the deed with trembling hands. This is remarkable, Mayor. I never expected. Neither did I, he admitted. But my grandson asked me a question last week that changed my perspective. He asked if I would be proud to tell him that his great-great-great-grandfather was a slave trader. I realized the answer was no, that I was ashamed, as I should be. And then he asked what I was doing about it, how I was honoring the memory of the people Josiah Holloway hurt. I had no answer, but now I do. Over the following months, the transformation of the Holloway estate and the house on Elm Street began. Archaeologists were brought in to excavate the sealed cellar room where Josiah Holloway's remains had been discovered in 1853. The findings confirmed Professor Freeman's theory. The bones were those of a man approximately Josiah's age, and there was evidence of violence matching Margaret's journal account. The discovery sparked national attention. The Holloway case became a focal point for discussions about historical memory, justice, and the ongoing impact of slavery on American society. Clara Thompson became a sought-after speaker, traveling across the country to share her great-great-grandmother's story, but the most profound impact was local. The people of Millbrook were forced to confront their town's complicity in the Holloway tragedy. The exhibition at the Historical Society expanded to include other stories of slavery and resistance in Massachusetts, revealing a hidden history that challenged the comfortable narrative of Northern moral superiority. Thomas Whitmore, the contractor who had discovered the portrait, found himself transformed by the experience. He enrolled in evening classes at the local college, studying history and historic preservation. He wanted to understand not just buildings, but the stories they contained, the lives they had witnessed. Daniel McAllister, inspired by the Holloway case, decided to become a journalist, committed to uncovering hidden histories and giving voice to the voiceless. His first major article, published in the Boston Globe, was about the Holloway family and the portrait that revealed their secret. As for the portrait itself, it remained the centerpiece of the Historical Society's collection, viewed by thousands of visitors each year. But it was no longer just a painting of a family. It had become a symbol of resistance, a testament to the human spirit's ability to survive and overcome even the most brutal oppression. On the first anniversary of the portrait's discovery, a ceremony was held at the Historical Society. Clara Thompson stood before the assembled crowd, now in her 80s and frail, but still possessing the dignity and strength of her ancestor. Beside her stood several other descendants of Margaret Freeman, representing 4 generations of a family that had survived and thrived against all odds. Clara spoke, her voice clear despite her age. My great-great-grandmother Margaret once wrote that liberty is not given, but taken, that dignity is not granted, but claimed. She lived those words, risking everything to secure freedom for her children. But her struggle didn't end with her escape. Every generation since has had to fight its own battles for dignity, justice, and equality. She gestured to the portrait. This painting was meant to be a symbol of respectability, a lie to cover the truth of slavery, but it became something else. Evidence, testimony, proof that even in the darkest times, truth has a way of emerging. The wall that hid this portrait for so many years couldn't contain the truth forever, and the silence that surrounded my family's story couldn't last forever either. Professor Freeman, who had become a close friend of the family, stepped forward. The Holloway case teaches us that history is not just about the past. It's about the present and the future. The choices made by Josiah Holloway, by Margaret Freeman, by Reverend Blackwood, by the artist Samuel Whitfield, by the people of Millbrook who chose silence over action, all those choices reverberate through time, affecting us today. He looked around at the diverse crowd that had gathered. But we also have choices. We can choose to acknowledge difficult truths or bury them. We can choose to learn from the past or repeat its mistakes. We can choose to honor the courage of people like Margaret Freeman or dismiss their stories as irrelevant to our lives. Mayor Holloway, standing in the back of the room, spoke up. I chose wrong initially. I chose comfort over truth, reputation over justice. But I've learned that there's no honor in protecting the legacy of evil, no dignity in silence when confronted with historical injustice. My ancestor was a monster, but I don't have to be defined by his choices. I can choose differently. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a bronze plaque to be installed at the house on Elm Street. It read, "In this place, Margaret Elizabeth Carter Freeman and her children, Sarah, William, and Thomas, were held in bondage by the slave trader Josiah Holloway. In November 1852, Margaret claimed her freedom and that of her children through an act of courage and desperation. This site stands as a memorial to all who resisted slavery and as a reminder that freedom requires constant vigilance and sacrifice. May we never forget their struggle, and may we never cease working toward a more just and equitable society." As the crowd dispersed, Thomas Whitmore found himself standing alone before the portrait one last time. He thought about the day he had discovered it, the moment when his sledgehammer had broken through the plaster to reveal the hidden truth. He had been just doing his job, demolishing an old building. He had no idea he was about to uncover a story that would change his life and his community. He looked at Margaret's painted face, at the determination hidden beneath the surface of her composed expression. "You won," he whispered to the portrait. "You and your children, you won. You got your freedom, and now, finally, you're getting your justice. Your story is being told, your courage is being honored, and maybe, just maybe, people will learn from what you endured and what you did." The portrait seemed to gaze back at him, those painted eyes holding secrets and sorrows, but also strength and hope. Thomas understood now why Samuel Whitfield had painted it the way he had, why he had included all those subtle details that testified to the truth. The artist had known that someday someone would see past the facade, would understand what the painting really depicted. That day had come, 163 years after the portrait was painted, 61 years after it was hidden behind a church wall. The truth had emerged, as truth always does eventually, no matter how deeply it's buried or how carefully it's concealed. Thomas turned to leave, but paused for one last look. In the fading afternoon light, the portrait seemed almost alive, the painted figures breathing with the weight of their history and the power of their survival. Margaret's hollow eyes no longer looked defeated to Thomas. They looked triumphant, as if she had known all along that her story would outlast the silence that tried to contain it. Freedom, Thomas realized, was indeed not given, but taken. And the truth, like freedom, could not be permanently suppressed. It would find a way to emerge, to speak, to bear witness. All it needed was someone willing to listen, to see, to remember. As he walked out of the Historical Society into the cool evening air, Thomas felt a sense of completion. The Holloway family's story was no longer hidden, their suffering was no longer denied, and their courage, particularly Margaret's extraordinary act of resistance, would be remembered and honored by generations to come. The portrait had been found, the truth had been told, and in that telling there was a kind of justice, imperfect and long delayed, but justice nonetheless. It was, Thomas thought, what Margaret would have wanted, for her story to serve as a reminder, a warning, and an inspiration to all who came after. The wall that had concealed the portrait was gone. The silence that had surrounded the Holloway family's fate was broken, and the message was clear: that freedom is precious, that courage exists even in the darkest circumstances, and that truth, however disturbing, must be acknowledged if we are ever to build a society worthy of the sacrifices made by people like Margaret Freeman and her children. As night fell over Millbrook, the portrait remained in its place of honor, illuminated by spotlights that would keep it visible even in darkness. A fitting metaphor, Thomas thought, for a story that had been hidden in darkness for so long, but now stood as a beacon, casting light on a painful past and pointing the way toward a more honest and just future. The discovery of the Holloway family portrait had been disturbing, as the plaque proclaimed, but it had also been necessary, revelatory, and ultimately redemptive. Not because it provided easy answers or comfortable conclusions, but because it forced people to confront the reality of slavery in all its horror, to acknowledge the courage of those who resisted it, and to commit themselves to ensuring that such evil would never again be permitted to flourish in silence and darkness. Margaret Freeman had won her freedom in 1852. In 2014, she won something more. Her place in history, her voice in the ongoing conversation about liberty, justice, and human dignity. And her portrait, once meant to conceal the truth, now revealed it for all to see. A permanent testament to the indomitable human spirit and its eternal quest for freedom.